Welcome to Byte Size, a series where we talk to traffic and mobility experts, discuss innovation, and highlight business leaders within transport and city planning. Hello, my name is Emily Bobbis, and welcome back to another episode of the Byte Size podcast. Often, when we consider innovations across transport, we think of the really big things, right? We think of AI, automation, and big data. But what if there were so much simpler solutions that were almost right underneath our noses? Often we neglect to think about how we can augment the existing infrastructure that we've already got. So improving our road friction or even the user experience of a pedestrian crossing, for example. So on this episode, our guest is Dave Jones. So Dave is the External Affairs Director for Smarterlite Group. They're a group dedicated to making our roads, buildings and infrastructure better, safer and greener. They provide safety and emergency solutions to the transport and building sectors with world-leading photoluminescent LED and surfacing technology. It's really interesting stuff. Today, we're talking about how something as small as improving the friction on our roads can decrease crash factors by up to 40%. Dave, who has over 25 years of experience across public and private businesses in transport, is a very strong advocate for spearheading a culture of innovation within government bodies and transport in general, and for improving the user experience of the built environment. Fostering a culture of innovation within transport and infrastructure benefits all roads users and roadside users. So how do we make this the norm? And that's kind of what we're discussing today. How can we create and foster this community and culture of consistent innovation to make our cities safer and more user-friendly, which is often not a term used in conjunction with transport. So Dave, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
My pleasure, Emily.
So the first question that I have for you is, of course, about your background and how you got involved in transport, but also Smarterlite.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a good question. And it was a fair while ago, but when I left university, I had some passionate transport lecturers, including Professor Mike Taylor, was quite influential. And I then went to work as a graduate for the South Australian Department of Road Transport, as it was then, and got really thrown in the deep end working in major projects, and then sent off to the country as part of the training program quite quickly, and ended up staying there for several years working in Port Lincoln, which is about 7 to 8 hour drive away from Adelaide. It wasn't the sort of place you could easily duck home for the weekends. You had to become part of the community as such, and being so far from a head office, you got thrown into everything from construction to traffic engineering to answering queries from members of the public, and I loved it. It was a great role, and I ended up being in country South Australia for probably 5 or 6 years. But then I met someone there, and we ended up moving to Melbourne and worked for AECOM, the engineering consultant, and then Victorian Public Service, and eventually ended up at the Australian Road Research Board as the regional director for 7 years, and through that role was just fortunate enough to work with some very talented people across so many of the transport disciplines and learn so much from being in a role where I was involved in contracts and relationships, but also reading and reviewing and having input to projects across surfacings and pavements and concrete structures and traffic engineering and networks and systems and training and walking and cycling and all those things. And it was such a great place to learn. And then I worked at the RACV, leading their media on transport advocacy for 7 years, and then decided it was just a time for a change and a break, and I took some long service leave, and I started looking for something quite different. And that's where I was told about this very interesting new company called Smarterlite. And I came in and had a chat to Gus Carfey, the owner of one of the owners of the business, and the chairman of the business. And he said, "Now come look at this." And he took me into this room. There's some amazing products in the surfacings area, the lighting area, and this really interesting science of something called photoluminescence. And he took me into this room and explained the products. I thought, that's good. I mean, the products look good, they're well made, they're founded in science, it's resonated with me as an engineer. And then he darkened the room, so it was pitch black, and the room lit up from photoluminescence. And it was, wow, this is a transformational technology, a disruptive technology, and I was sold at that point. This is something that would be really exciting to be part of, a new disruptor in the transport space and the building safety space as well, that could really make a difference.
That's really cool. I always really like hearing people's kind of origin stories, if you will, because considering you've had such extensive, broad experience across basically everything, it's almost rare to find that as well. And then you've kind of moved from more government to private sector stuff now.
Yes, and many of the things that I once accepted as being normal and conventional, when you work in the private sector, you start realising some of those things you accepted and were even part of or perhaps helped create, you see the other side of it and what effect that can have on innovators, disruptors, companies who employ people, manufacture things in Australia, all important things that we need. So this has given me a really interesting insight and enables us, because our organisation is a blend of people from many different sectors, worked all over the world doing amazing things. And we have some very interesting discussions and debates. And we all bring our perspectives and voices and opinions. And you as a person working in the innovation space as well, I'm sure would appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. I think some of the discussions that come out of it, particularly from switching from private to public or vice versa, are quite interesting to kind of have a bit as a contrast.
Yeah, it's a real eye opener, and I would encourage people listening to, if you've worked in government, to never refuse an opportunity to join the private sector, and vice versa. It gives you an interesting perspective, and only by people moving between the two do we take private sector expertise and knowledge and ability to pivot and do things differently into the public service and public service thinking about transparency and accountability and public good needs to come to the private sector. So people need to move between both.
Yeah, absolutely. So Smarterlite, back to them for a minute. So you provide solutions for like a lot of different things, kind of as you mentioned. You've got the photoluminescence for the buildings, but then you've also got things that relate to infrastructure projects. But I'm also particularly interested in how you guys are disrupting road safety, because it's something that hasn't really been disrupted since the introduction of seatbelts and RBTs in like the 1970s. How does something like, you've vaguely mentioned like the friction treatments on road surfaces. So how does high friction treatments on road surfaces, for example, impact upon road safety?
Yeah, thank you. And OmniGrip HF is a high friction surface treatment using a material called calcined bauxite. And it's an amazing material that can, we genuinely believe, transform road safety. But strangely, it's these days relatively unknown in road safety circles, and we've got we speculate on some reasons why. It's a proven technology out of the 1960s in the UK. It's been picked up in a significant way in the USA, and the US Federal Highway Administration calls it part of the first line of defence. It's about keeping drivers and riders, motorcycle riders, on the road in their lane, because it increases the friction between a road surface and a vehicle's tyre, so that the driver's less likely to skid or lose control on, for example, a sharp bend if they go in too fast, or they can come to a stop much quicker. In fact, it's 25 to just over 30% of the sorts of numbers that are talked about. And I've been told it's part of the standard treatment on pedestrian crossings in urban areas in the UK, because a car that brakes suddenly because a person walks out and they perhaps weren't prepared or paying attention, they can stop faster and less likely to hit the pedestrian. If they hit the pedestrian, it's at a lower speed, and the pedestrian is more likely to survive or have reduced injuries, if any at all. And it's a standard treatment, so it's a well-accepted technology. Now, in Australia, we provide this calcined bauxite high-friction surface treatment, and we've applied about 200 locations over many years in Australia. But it's quite unusual where it isn't used. So it's quite big it has been in the past in Queensland. It's used somewhat in metropolitan Melbourne, but it's used virtually not at all in country Victoria on rural roads, which is really unusual because that's the location where it could make the biggest difference. And it's also used somewhat in Western Australia as well through a distributor of ours. But other places are just haven't used it, and people seem genuinely unaware of it. And we've speculated on reasons, and my personal theory is I think a lot of the road safety engineers and traffic engineers in Australia are trained to think about signs and perhaps lines and crash barriers. And the area of road surfacing and road pavements is seen as a different discipline. And because high friction surface treatment is a road surface treatment, it's perhaps not considered as part of the package of solutions to reduce or eliminate a black spot, particularly on country roads or a high-risk location on urban roads. Several states use what's called crash reduction factors, which is based on studies of crashes, averaged out what is the particular road safety measure, how effective is it at reducing crashes. And the number for high-friction surfaces that's used in Australia is it reduces injury crashes by 40% in general. And I've looked at one of those studies and it assessed sites that were really good applications or locations for it and others that were not so good. So it's an average of good and bad. That particular study found that used in a targeted way at the right locations, the number was like 80 or 90% reduction in crashes. And that's backed up by states in the US that have found up to 95 or 100% on high-risk locations where people were losing control.
Wow.
And the big advantage of it is not only is it so effective when used right, but it's so fast to apply. It's like any surface. It can basically be said we need the new surface from A to B, and within half a day or a day, that new surface goes down and it's working the moment that it's finished. So there's very little disruption to traffic when you compare it to other very common road safety measures like crash barriers that take months of planning and design and engagement and consultation with affected property owners if they can't access their farm gates, and emergency services for access to the roadside. And then you've got weeks or months of construction and disruption to traffic. And whereas a surface, just like an ordinary maintenance reseal, goes down within hours. And, and these treatments are as effective. And that's why we see it as quite a big disruptor, because thinking in Australia isn't around, in our opinion, road safety isn't focused necessarily on road surfaces, even though road surfaces, safe road surfaces, high friction surfaces, can keep vehicles on the road in their lane and reduce a crash. A crash barrier is a plan B because the crash is already happening. Someone's already lost control. They're leaving the road, leaving their lane and crossing over onto the wrong side. Their vehicle is going to be smashed up. The right barrier means the person will have less severe or no injuries, but the crash has happened. Whereas the surface, the right surface, which is much cheaper to install and faster to install, might have actually stopped that loss of control happening in the first place.
Wow, yeah, that's insane, I guess, in two respects. The first one being the percentages by which crashes are decreased. But then also that's a very interesting disparity, particularly between, say, urban and rural, because I think I'm erring on the side to say it's more common knowledge in Australia in particular that if you're in rural areas, you're more likely to have more road accidents. So it's very interesting that it's something that could be considered proactive is not being used as much in those areas where I think they probably need it maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, I would agree. And a really strong, I guess, case for them is on popular motorcycling routes. Now, people enjoy motorcycle riding through hilly and mountainous areas. In Victoria, where I am, Great Ocean Road and the Yarra Ranges, and I'm sure it's the Blue Mountains and the hinterland up in Queensland and the Gold Coast. I'm sure they're very popular riding spots in all those states, and every state would have it. And putting a high friction surface onto some of those curves and bends might just keep a rider upright and on the road in their lane, at very little cost. Crash barriers are always a problem. Any sort of barrier for a rider is in there impacting with very little protection, a hard object or a relatively hard object. It's much better to keep them upright and in their lane in the first place. So motorcycling routes would, in rural areas or country areas, mountainous areas, would just be a clear-cut case for this technology.
Yeah, interesting. So speaking on the idea of crashes as well, it leads very nicely to the next question, which is that almost 40% of fatal crashes outside of cities occur at night. So what do you think could be done on a practical level, say for councils? You mentioned kind of photoluminescence and road markings, but also possibly at like a state or a national policy level to kind of discuss the changes that could be made?
Yes, it's, as I said earlier, and as you referred to, part of the Smarterlite Group is a company called Safety Path, and our Chief Technology Officer, Zoran Avuka, has spent nearly 20 years developing what we think is the world's best photoluminescent materials, and we use it in building exit signs, which is allowed under Australia's National Construction Code. But we've taken that same photoluminescent technology and put it into paints and coatings. And we're quite fortunate that Regional Roads Victoria worked with us to put down photoluminescent line marking on the Great Ocean Road at a place called Monks Creek, which is not too far from Geelong. It's quite amazing at night, because this photoluminescent line marking or safety path line marking, it looks like white line marking during the day, but at night it actually lights up. It absorbs daylight and it stores that energy and emits it at night. Oh. And it still reflects light like ordinary line marking paint within the headlights of a vehicle, but you can see the photoluminescent line ahead and outside beyond where the vehicle headlights are lighting up. So if a road is curved, headlights light up what's right in front of the vehicle, whereas the photoluminescent line marking continues and you can see the curve of the road stretching away from the driver. So we're very fortunate that Regional Roads Victoria has gone ahead with this application of it to demonstrate the technology. What's interesting for councils and road authorities is that photoluminescent line marking is enhanced visibility. So it is more visible than ordinary road line marking and pavement marking. But it's not as expensive to install and operate as road lighting. So road lighting, particularly in country areas, you need, in most cases, power to go to the road lighting, and you need poles to be put up beside the road, all the design and construction costs of that, and then you've got the ongoing maintenance costs. And it's just unaffordable for long lengths of high-risk roads in what's otherwise a very dark location in country areas. So we see photoluminescent line marking as bridging the gap between ordinary road line marking and the incredibly expensive electric road lighting, in that it will perform between the two in road safety, and it's significantly cheaper than electric lighting.
Interesting. There looks like there's also an application in terms of asset maintenance as well, because like you said, it might not necessarily be financially or physically kind of possible or feasible to put in fancy electric or even sometimes solar lighting in the middle of nowhere when it's very hard to kind of access that site regularly to maintain that infrastructure.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Everything has a maintenance cost. So this line marking is no more difficult to maintain. It lasts as long as ordinary road line marking. It can be easily applied. It doesn't need any special equipment or expense and hassle that an ordinary road lighting would have. And ordinary road lighting also has the problem that every pole that's put up becomes a new roadside hazard. So it either has to have a frangible pole that can be crumpled when it's hit, but it's still an object beside the road, or it needs to have a crash barrier put around it, and both the pole and or the barrier becomes a new hazard, whereas this doesn't become a hazard at all. It actually just solves a problem without creating a different sort of risk. So that's all good. And we've also put the same photoluminescent material into road signs as well. So we can have signs that are simply lit by photoluminescence, and photoluminescence absorbs light and then emits that light. So they're bright, very bright when night first falls. The signs are still reflective, so they still perform like a reflective road sign as well. So there's no disadvantage. They're just better than ordinary road signs. But if there was a high-risk location that needed an internally illuminated sign all night, we have one that's actually got a very energy-efficient solar-powered LED booster that gives it a bit more brightness, so it can remain bright all night. So some really exciting innovations that we've taken from the building sector and we've moved them to the transport sector, where there's clear evidence that internally illuminated signs and perform slightly better in terms of crash reduction. I think some of the data is around 5% better, and 5% off the road toll is still significant. But we're looking at putting some of these signs on roads and doing some crash evaluations to get some even better data, because we think the numbers will be better. And line marking, it's there for people to see. It's clearly more visible. And we're very fortunate that we received an Australian government grant, the Road Safety Innovation Fund, in round one. We're one of only 4 private sector organisations to receive a grant from the Australian government, and they've given us some really crucial support last year.
Amazing. It sounds really awesome. And I guess an unintended side effect of making this podcast is it makes me very excited about things that normal people in their 20s aren't excited about, like road markings and traffic and just road friction.
Who would have thought?
Exactly. So for those who are listening and aren't aware, in Australia, the National Road Safety Strategy is based on something called the Safe Systems Approach. So for the benefit of people who have no idea what I'm talking about, the Safe Systems Principles is the Australian government's long-term holistic view of the road transport system and all the interactions between roads, roadsides, speeds, vehicles, and basically everyone who uses that infrastructure. Just condensing it a little bit is safety could be arguably two-pronged. It can be people inside vehicles, whether that's a car or a bus or a truck or anything like that. But there's also this more vulnerable road user, such as pedestrians or people on bikes. How is new technology maybe addressing this other side of the safety coin and addressing the safe system principles, particularly for pedestrians and bike riders?
Yeah, there's some very important things that are happening, but it's probably in general a space that not enough is happening. There's certainly a lot of community debate around new technologies like scooters and things on footpaths, and whether that is good for pedestrians or bad, the risk of conflict and injury and things. But in terms of some good things, we've taken what's called the tactile ground surface indicator, as the jargon for you, a TGSI. So in plain English, that's the bumps on a footpath as you approach a hazard. So traffic lights just about everywhere now, and ramps at railway stations and the like, you'll find those bumps, and they're called simply a TGSI, a tactile ground surface indicator. So we've taken and enhanced a technology to actually make them more visible by incorporating an LED light in them. What happens is that the lights are actually inside the tactile ground surface indicator. We just call them LED safety tactiles, change colour with the traffic lights. So when you approach a signalised pedestrian, a signalised intersection, rather than just looking at what's called traditionally the red or green across the road, which is quite small and hard to see across the traffic, we're putting a large visual indicator where the pedestrian is standing, and that's the bumps directly in front of the pedestrian, and they change colour. They're connected to the traffic signal, so they're red when it's don't walk, and they're green when it's safe to walk. I'm now saying quite a lot to people. If you were looking at traffic lights as a new way of controlling traffic, and you're thinking about pedestrian safety, there's no way, if you're doing human-centred design, would you think that it's adequate to put the warning of safety on the far side of the hazard, because that's what ordinary traffic lights actually do. There's this hazard of moving vehicles in front of you, but the warning is actually located across the road, and it's quite small and hard to see. So if you're walking in a crowd and it's short, or you've got some sort of vision impairment, you're distracted, using a mobile phone, looking down, listening to music, talking to friends, or in a city environment, it's quite legitimate for a pedestrian. It's called distracted, but cities are designed to get your attention, to look at shop windows and signs and things flashing. We as a society accept that the warning of whether it's safe to walk onto a road or not is a red or green light across the road, and some sort of audible warning in most cases as well, which can be hard to hear at times, or if you've got a hearing impairment, you might not better hear either.
Yeah.
So we've taken this tactile and put these lights into it. So it's a large coloured block where the pedestrian is, and it's red, warning you there's a hazard before you actually walk on the road. So it's quite transformational. And when you see one, because there's one that's been in place for an intersection we did several years ago, it's funded by Victoria's TAC, in cooperation with what was then called Vic Roads, it's now the Department of Transport, down on Swanson Street and Little Collins Street near Melbourne Town Hall. And it's quite popular. It was installed at a location to demonstrate the technology, so a proper evaluation on crashes hasn't been done because there was no crashes there in the first place, and the road at Little Collins Street is actually closed at lunchtime because there's so many pedestrians. It's closed every lunchtime to traffic. So it's not a good spot for a crash evaluation, but it's a good spot to demonstrate the technology because it's so visible. But in terms of crash effectiveness, it's based on technology used in South Korea. They evaluated 22 installations by some Korean university academics. The study was by Park, Yu and Choi, and it was published in 2014. They evaluated 22 crosswalks and found there was a 41% reduction in crashes, 39% reduction in injuries, and 55% reduction in fatalities. And they actually calculated a benefit cost ratio of 56, which is amazing. So the benefits in terms of reduced injuries was more than 50 times the costs of installing the system. We've taken the technology, we've adapted it and modified it to suit how Australian footpaths are built and the fact that we wanted ours to be on during the day. And so we've changed some of the technology in it. But we don't have a location that's done that same sort of crash study as I explained before. But we did just ask a small sample of people what they thought. And 68% of people said they actually felt safer as pedestrians. They felt safer in the city when walking through that intersection compared to others. And 59% said they felt the intersection was actually easier to use. They feel safer being a pedestrian, so that's surely a positive message for encouraging people to walk. And there's a degree of visibility for drivers as well. So the South Koreans identified that drivers can actually increase the visibility of the pedestrians at night that were waiting to cross the road, and they knew when the pedestrians had a green light and might walk out.
Yeah, okay. It almost sounds a little bit like you're improving the user experience of the built environment with a focus on traffic lights, which is, I guess, you kind of almost take these infrastructures for granted sometimes because they've been there for so long. You're kind of like, oh, well, that's just kind of how it is and everyone accepts it. But then if you actually look into it, you're like, actually, there are different ways that we can improve this that no one's actually thought of because I think it's just been accepted as the norm.
Yeah, absolutely right, because we do accept it as the norm and we train our children to accept it as the norm, and people don't know of anything better. But we all become complacent, and we should be safe, even though we're complacent, walking around our own cities, doing what the city's designed to do, and that's be a place to live and enjoy and be distracted by the things that bring us to the city in the first place. And the city should be designed and built to make you safe. And this sort of technology can take what we've taken for granted, as you said, Emily, and make it that much easier to see at a glance.
Yeah, awesome. Next time I'm in Melbourne, I'll definitely have to check out that intersection. Or you could just come to Sydney, like whichever is easy.
Well, we'd love them to be there.
Okay, so my last question I always have for people is kind of a little bit more aspirational and like in a perfect world kind of questions. So Australia's National Road Safety Strategy from 2011 to 2020, so like a couple of months out of date now, had a target of reducing annual road deaths by 30%. And in 2018, vehicle occupants accounted for like 64% of road deaths. So in a perfect world, what one change do you think you would make in the way that we approach road safety?
Yeah, it's a tough question because in some ways there's so many things that could be done. But I think coming from, speaking from the heart and the environment that we're in at the moment, it's about councils, road agencies, road managers taking on a culture of innovation and being prepared to try and to do and to act fast. Particularly in a post-COVID environment. I think there are many innovative companies with good technologies that need someone to step outside the bounds of their own comfort zone and be prepared to take measured, calculated risks and give people and companies and opportunities to try new things and evaluate those things. Move quickly to do it, move quickly to evaluate it as short-term and long-term measures and adopt what works. Now, I realise there's a lot of pressure on public servants and governments that if they trialled something and it failed, they'd get massive public criticism. And there's a societal problem with perhaps allowing people in roles of decision-making roles to actually have a go and try something different. And so there's a bigger societal issue about allowing that and other people to try things on the chance that we'll discover the next great thing. For people in decision-making roles in road safety, in road agencies, they've got to step away with what they're comfortable with, what's easy to procure and implement, and try something else on the chance that it will save perhaps many more lives than what they're doing, perhaps more cost effectively. And you know too well, Emily, as well, that when you're working in the innovation space, there's huge challenges to getting your technology accepted, and it's a catch-22 or chicken or egg sort of thing. So we've dealt with agencies that say, and councils, and they come to us and they say, we love your technology. Is it approved by whatever their local road agency is?
Yeah.
And I say, well, no, or it's on the road in this location, but we want to see a copy of it being on the register of approved products. So you go to the agency and say, what do we need to do to put it on the register of approved products? And they say, well, you need someone locally to put it in and support it, or to be an advocate for it. I said, but they won't. No one. Well, we've got people that want to do it, but only if you approve it first. But you're saying you won't approve it unless they do it. And everyone sort of washes their hands of it because it's too hard, too risky. That's so disappointing.
Yeah,
we've had some success, but they were largely led by people who were brave, who did their research, understood the technology, and allocated their budgets to put those projects in. And those people need to be given a huge pat on the back for being prepared to do that. I'm sure many people in the road safety and innovation space have stories, and some won't be as good as or as lucky as us. And we really need people to both move fast, be brave, be prepared for things may go wrong, and be prepared to correct and adapt and learn and give feedback so the next time it's even better.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the public scrutiny aspect as well. It's kind of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't with the new kind of trials for innovation. And so that I feel like our policymakers and people in government have a bit of a tough job sometimes trying to decide that risk cost benefit analysis of trialing and innovation unless somebody's going to kind of chuck a bit of a fit about it.
Yeah, and benefit cost analysis may not be particularly strong for an early technology because innovators have much higher costs for the first versions of products.
True.
They're often made at a small scale, so their costs are higher, but it's only when people adopt them and they're more broadly applied that their costs come down and things become more competitive and all those sorts of things. So they're all challenges that innovators unfortunately face, and we need decision makers and funding bodies to accept that. And things like the Australian Government's Road Safety Innovation Fund are absolute gems for the sector to have a means of developing and trialling and sharing data and having some assistance from the Australian Government for projects anywhere in Australia.
Awesome. Well, Dave, thank you so much for taking your time out to chat with me today about Smarterlite and then just road safety in general and what can be done from kind of a less thought about method, I guess, with user experience and road friction and the things we don't often think about.
Wonderful. And thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate what you're doing for the sector as much as myself. So thank you again, and I've appreciated the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners.
If you'd like to know a little bit more about Dave or Smarterlite or Omni Group Direct Group, you can visit their website, which is www.smarterlite.com, all one word, so it's SMARTERLITE. And if you'd like to know more about Byte or Compass IoT, the company that produces this podcast, you can visit our website, which is www.compassiot.com.au. Until next time.